We here at Apologetics Underground know that your time is valuable. And the truth is that we just don't have enough time to go over all the different Old Testament prophets that speak to this coming Messiah. There's just too many. So let's focus on one of the big ones, shall we? In fact, when it comes to Old Testament prophets talking about the coming Messiah, you really can't go wrong with a guy named Isaiah. Isaiah is a southern prophet living in the divided kingdom, meaning he lives in the southern kingdom of Judah during this time when there were two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And he writes to both kingdoms, talking to them about the sins of idolatry that consume both cultures. But he talks a lot about this coming Messiah. And he does it, amazingly, roughly 700 years before the birth of Christ. So it's a long ways off still. But he starts making these very specific claims as to qualifications that the Messiah has to meet. Like we said, Isaiah talks about this Messiah guy quite a bit. Makes a variety of different claims about who he has to be. And we're going to talk about a few of the other ones in just a second. But I want to focus on one chapter in Isaiah specifically because of, well, not only how specific it is about the Messiah, but it also shows how different the Messiah is from man's maybe conception of a coming king. And it's found in Isaiah 53, starting in verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned, every one, to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Doesn't sound like much of a king to me. In fact, when I really think of the idea of a king, I think of guys like, well, Saul. I think of King Arthur. I think of that big, strapping, supermanish guy with the crown. But again, it doesn't matter what I think about the Messiah, this anointed one. As we've already shown, it's God making the decision as to who this Messiah is and what he has to be like. And here he says his chosen one, his representative, his king to sit on his throne, he's going to suffer for us. He's going to bear in his suffering the iniquities of us all. In fact, it goes as far to say that not only is he going to be wounded, but by his wounds we are to be healed. But that's not all it says about him. Isaiah keeps going. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. I hope you caught that too, because the first section talks about how this Messiah is going to suffer. He's going to be wounded. In fact, it goes as far as to say he's going to be crushed. By who? By God. But here he even goes farther. He says he's going to die. And he's going to die in such a way that he is numbered among the transgressors, even though he is not a transgressor. This is a suffering Messiah, and one that bears sin. That's his job, to come and represent God by bearing the sins of those who have sinned against God. Not a normal king in the human sense, is it? But instead, a very, very divine consideration of a king. So before we start to wrap up here, let's just kind of get a sense, a feel for what we've talked about so far. So we're looking at prophecies in the Old Testament which start as far back as 4,000 years ago, and we jumped ahead to about 1,000 years before Christ, so 3,000 years ago, and then we jumped to about 700 years before Christ, so about 2,700 years ago. And we have all these details to consider regarding this promised Messiah. God told Abraham that through this Messiah, which will be one of his offspring, all the nations of the world shall be blessed, not just the one nation that he makes Abraham into. Then we discovered in this conversation of what the word Messiah means, that this Messiah is going to be God's chosen representative, a king. And what's interesting about that is that it's not man's choice or man's decision or man's idea as to what a king should be. It's God's definition of what makes a king. And then we saw in Isaiah, again, 700 years before the birth of Christ, that this king, this divinely chosen king, this Messiah, is not going to be one that just reigns and sits pretty on a throne and looking really good in a crown. No, he's going to suffer, he's going to be wounded, he's going to be crushed, and he's going to die, numbered among the transgressors, even though he's not one, so that he can bring salvation to those transgressors. That's quite a picture of this Messiah. But when we consider them, before we start answering who this Messiah really is, even though I know you're starting to figure it out, we have to really think about something. The variety and the number of all of these different prophecies. We've already talked about baseball, but let's talk about a slightly different game, shall we? Let's talk about playing the lottery. I know that's not something you expect to hear about when you're watching a Christianity video, but just go with me on this. Let's say you go up to your wife and you tell her, "Sweetheart, I predict that one day I will win the lottery." That's really not an outlandish prediction. I mean, because there's all sorts of ways you can win the lottery. You can just go and buy a simple cheapo scratcher and discover, hey, I just won $5. Well, guess what? You're a prophet. Your prediction came true. You won the lottery. What I'm trying to show you is that the more specific the prediction, well, the less likely it will come to pass. Let's say you go to your wife again and say, "Sweetheart, I predict that one day I will win the lottery and I will get no less than $10 million. More likely or less likely? But let's keep going. Let's say I predict that I will win no less than $10 million by playing this set of specific numbers that will all be hit. Now we're in astronomical territory. So much so that you might as well not even bother playing. Because even though sometimes people win the big bucks, the chances that you will win the big bucks are very, very low. Let's bring that idea back to the Messiah. You see, we've already made a few predictions from the Old Testament as to who this Messiah has to be, what he has to do. We've talked about how he has to be in the family of Abraham. We've talked about how he has to suffer and die, and that he has to be counted among the transgressors. That's 3 ways in which we have to be specific with our predictions, and the ways in which our predictions have to be fulfilled. But let's add a couple more. That's just 3. What if we add another 5, bringing our total up to 8? Here's some other ones that the Old Testament talks about. That the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem. That he must be born of a virgin. That he has to have his hands and his feet pierced. That he has to be buried with the rich when he dies. And that he will not have a single bone broken in his death. Now we're up to 8. Imagine the astronomical conditions and chances that it would take for one guy to fulfill all of that. Let's bring it back to Babe Ruth. He goes up to the plate. He points to center field. The pitch is thrown, and crack! He nails it. Amazing. So amazing that a lot of people don't even believe it happened. In order for Babe Ruth to replicate the conditions that we're talking about concerning this guy known as the Messiah, he would have to not call one shot and nail it. He'd have to call 8 shots in a row and nail it. But what if I told you that the number is much, much higher than 8? What if I told you that within the 39 books of the Old Testament, there are over 300 specific prophecies leveled for the Messiah to fulfill? So now what does Babe have to do? He has to nail not 1, not 8, but the next 300 shots in a row, calling them out and placing them in the exact section and seat when the ball lands. I think we can understand that that's not just unlikely, it's all but impossible. I think you see that there's an awful lot to unpack here. I mean, just those 8 predictions alone would take a while. And as we've already said, we want to be respectful of your time. So I hope you'll come back and join us for our next conversation in this video series, where we start to see if there's anybody that actually does fulfill those 300 requirements. Let's see if somebody can actually go up to the plate and hit 300 home runs in a row. Because if there is, that's a guy that I think we have to take pretty seriously. But that's another conversation for another time. For right now, we'd like to thank you for joining us right here on Apologetics Underground.